My aunt left her fortune to the niece who needs it most, so I made sure I'd lost everything by the time she died. I was 28 and had everything going for me when my aunt first mentioned her will during a family dinner. She sat at the head of the table, her diamond rings catching the light as she gestured dramatically about how she planned to leave her considerable fortune to whichever of her nieces needed it most when she passed away. My cousin smirked from across the table, clearly thinking she had it in the bag since she was still in college and working part-time at a coffee shop. I own my own small business, had a decent savings account, and lived in a nice apartment downtown. The conversation moved on to other topics, but something about the way my aunt looked at each of us stayed with me. Over the next few months, I couldn't shake the feeling that this inheritance could change everything. My aunt had built a successful chain of boutique hotels over decades, and everyone knew she was worth millions. The way she talked about wanting to help the niece who truly needed it most made me realize that my current success might actually work against me. I started thinking about what it would mean to be the one who needed help the most. My cousin was already struggling financially, barely making ends meet with her part-time job and student loans. My other cousin had just gone through a messy divorce and was living with her parents while trying to rebuild her life. Meanwhile, I was the successful one, the one who seemed to have it all figured out. But what if that changed? What if I could show my aunt that I needed her help more than anyone else? The thought consumed me for weeks. I found myself lying awake at night, calculating what it would take to appear desperate enough to warrant inheriting millions. The more I thought about it, the more justified it seemed. After all, I had worked hard for everything I had, and if I was willing to sacrifice it all for the chance at something bigger, didn't that show dedication? I decided to quit my job and drain my savings account to look like the perfect candidate for her money. I handed in my resignation letter on a Wednesday morning, telling my boss I needed to pursue other opportunities. The look of shock on his face was almost enough to make me reconsider, but I pushed through. I had been building my client base for 3 years, and walking away from it felt like jumping off a cliff. My business partner couldn't understand why I was suddenly so eager to sell my share of the company for far less than it was worth. I made up some story about wanting to travel and find myself, which wasn't entirely false since I was definitely trying to find a new version of myself. The hardest part was emptying my savings account. I had been so proud of reaching 6 figures in my emergency fund, and watching that number drop to zero felt physically painful. I moved out of my nice apartment and into a tiny studio in a questionable neighborhood. I sold my car and started taking public transportation everywhere. I even sold most of my designer clothes and expensive jewelry, keeping only the basics. Within 2 months, I had successfully transformed myself from a successful businesswoman into someone who appeared to be barely getting by. My aunt noticed the changes immediately when I showed up to her birthday party, looking significantly more worn down than usual. She pulled me aside and asked what was happening in my life. I told her about losing my job, about having to move, about struggling to make ends meet. The concern in her eyes was exactly what I had hoped for, but it also made me feel incredibly guilty. She offered to help me financially right then and there, but I declined, saying I needed to figure things out on my own. This seemed to impress her even more. My family started treating me like a charity case, which made me realize how far I'd fallen. The family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as everyone began to see me as the one who needed help. My parents would slip me cash when they thought no one was looking, and my siblings started paying for my meals whenever we went out together. My cousin, the one who had been struggling in college, actually offered to lend me money from her small savings account. The irony wasn't lost on me that the people I was competing against for the inheritance were the ones trying to help me through what they thought was a rough patch. My aunt started inviting me over for dinner more frequently, and during these visits, she would share stories about her own struggles when she was younger. She talked about how her first hotel had nearly failed, how she had lived on rice and beans for months while trying to keep the business afloat. She seemed to see something of herself in my current situation, and I could tell she was becoming more attached to the idea of helping me specifically. The guilt was eating away at me, but I had come too far to turn back now. The most difficult part was maintaining the facade with my friends. I had to decline invitations to expensive restaurants and weekend trips, claiming I couldn't afford them. Some friends started treating me differently, like I was damaged goods or someone to be pitied. I lost a few friendships during this time, people who couldn't understand why I had seemingly given up on everything I had worked for. I told myself it would all be worth it in the end, but the social isolation was harder to bear than I had anticipated. My aunt's health started declining around this time, and she began talking more seriously about her will and her wishes for the inheritance. She would often mention how proud she was of me for not giving up despite my circumstances, and how she believed I had the character to use her money wisely. Each compliment felt like a knife twisting in my chest, because I knew I was deceiving someone who genuinely cared about me. I started gambling online to make my financial situation look even more desperate than it already was. The online gambling started as a way to lose money quickly and appear even more financially desperate. I figured if I could show some gambling debts or losses, it would make my situation look even more dire. What I didn't anticipate was how addictive it would become. I started with small amounts, deliberately losing money on sports betting and online poker. The plan was to create a paper trail of financial irresponsibility that would make me look like someone who truly needed guidance and support. But something changed after a few weeks of intentional losing. I started getting small wins here and there, and the rush of winning felt incredible after months of deliberately sabotaging my life. I found myself staying up until 3 in the morning, chasing bigger wins, telling myself I was just method acting for my inheritance plan. The wins were sporadic, but enough to keep me hooked. I started using credit cards to fund my gambling, thinking I could always pay them off once I inherited my aunt's money. The debt piled up faster than I had anticipated. What started as a controlled demolition of my finances became a genuine financial crisis. I was no longer pretending to be desperate, I actually was desperate. The credit card companies started calling constantly, and I was struggling to make minimum payments. My tiny studio apartment felt like a prison, and I was eating ramen noodles not by choice, but out of necessity. The line between my act and reality had completely disappeared. My aunt noticed that I seemed more stressed and anxious during our dinner visits. When she asked what was wrong, I broke down and told her about the gambling debts. The shame in her eyes was devastating, but she didn't lecture me or turn away. Instead, she held my hand and told me that everyone makes mistakes, and that's what family is for. She offered to help me pay off the debts, but I refused, saying I needed to face the consequences of my actions. This seemed to solidify her belief that I was the right choice for her inheritance. My cousin discovered what I'd been doing and threatened to tell my aunt the truth about my schemes. My cousin, the one who had been struggling through college, showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening. She had been doing some digging after noticing how quickly my life had fallen apart and how convenient the timing seemed with my aunt's declining health. She had screenshots of my old social media posts showing my successful business, my nice apartment, and my comfortable lifestyle. She had also somehow found records of my deliberate business sale and the timeline of my financial decisions. She sat on my ratty couch and laid out everything she had discovered like a detective presenting evidence. The look of disgust on her face was worse than any anger she could have expressed. She told me she had spent months feeling guilty about potentially inheriting money when she thought I was genuinely struggling. And now she realized I had been manipulating the entire family. She had been working extra shifts at the coffee shop to help pay for her education while I was playing elaborate games for money. The confrontation lasted for hours. She demanded to know how I could deceive someone who loved me so much, how I could watch family members worry about me and offer help when I was essentially running a con game. I tried to explain that I had genuinely struggled after giving up my business, that the gambling had become real, that I wasn't entirely faking my desperation anymore. But she wasn't interested in my justifications. She said I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I would tell my aunt the truth about what I had done, or she would tell her herself. She said she would give me 1 week to come clean, and if I didn't, she would present all the evidence she had gathered. The thought of my aunt discovering the truth was terrifying, but the thought of losing the inheritance after everything I had sacrificed was equally devastating. I begged my cousin to reconsider, but she was firm in her decision. That night, I realized I was trapped by my own scheme. I had genuinely lost everything in pursuit of my aunt's money, and now I was facing the possibility of losing that too. The gambling debts were real, the isolation was real, and the shame was definitely real. I had become the desperate person I had been pretending to be, but now it might not even matter. My aunt called me to her deathbed and revealed she'd known about my plan all along. My aunt's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next few days, and she was moved to hospice care. She asked specifically for me to visit her alone, saying she had something important to discuss. I walked into her room expecting to confess everything, but she spoke first. She told me she had known about my scheme from the very beginning, that she had been watching me deliberately destroy my life for the chance at her inheritance. The calm way she said it made my blood run cold. She explained that she had always been a shrewd businesswoman, and that she had built her fortune by understanding people's motivations and desires. She had suspected something was wrong when I suddenly gave up my successful business for no apparent reason, and she had hired a private investigator to look into my activities. She knew about the deliberate financial decisions, the gambling, and even about my cousin's recent investigation. She had been testing me the entire time, waiting to see how far I would go. What shocked me most was that she wasn't angry. She seemed almost impressed by my dedication to the deception, calling it a level of commitment she hadn't expected from me. She said that watching me actually struggle and develop real problems had been interesting, and that she believed I had learned valuable lessons about what it meant to truly need help. She had watched me become genuinely desperate and had seen how I handled real adversity versus manufactured adversity. She told me that my cousin had indeed come to her with all the evidence, but that she had already known everything my cousin had discovered and more. She had been waiting to see if I would come clean on my own, and my failure to do so had been the final test. She said she was disappointed that I hadn't trusted her enough to be honest, but she understood the psychology behind my choices. She had done questionable things in her own business dealings over the years, and she recognized the hunger for success that had driven me to such extremes. Then she delivered the final twist that changed everything. She told me that she had decided to leave her entire fortune to me anyway, not because I had successfully deceived her, but because I had shown her exactly who I was under pressure. She said that someone willing to sacrifice everything for a goal, even through questionable means, was exactly the kind of person she wanted handling her business empire. She believed I had the ruthless determination necessary to grow her wealth rather than simply spend it. The inheritance was mine, but it came with conditions that would test me for the rest of my life. She had structured it so that I would have to rebuild and manage her business interests, and any failure to grow the inheritance would result in it being donated to charity. She had also arranged for my cousin to be given a substantial sum as a reward for her honesty and integrity, ensuring that my scheming hadn't cost her anything in the end. As I sat in that hospice room, listening to my aunt explain how she had orchestrated this entire situation as a final test of character, I realized that I had gotten exactly what I wanted in the most unexpected way possible. I had destroyed my life for money, and now I was inheriting millions along with the responsibility to prove I deserved it. The woman who had seemed so sweet and caring had been playing a game more complex than anything I had imagined, and somehow I had passed her test by failing to be honest. My aunt passed away 2 days later, and I found myself the heir to a fortune that came with more strings attached than I had ever anticipated. The money was mine, but so was the weight of knowing exactly how I had earned it and what it said about who I was as a person. I had won the game, but I wasn't entirely sure I liked the person who had been willing to play it.